Moggcast, a fortnightly conversation with Jacob Rees-Mogg about the topics of the day. Hello, and welcome to the 44th episode of Conservative Homes Moggcast. I'm Henry Hill, presenting it for the first time, and here in his usual place is Jacob Rees-Mogg. Good morning, Jacob.
Hello, good morning, Henry.
How are you?
Extremely well, thank you. And you?
Oh, I'm all right. Lockdown getting to us all, wearing us down a bit. But, broadly speaking, the weather's nice. We're allowed outside. Freedoms are incrementally increasing, although not as fast as it appears some would like. I suppose there's only really one story to start with this week, and that is the scenes of disorder that we've seen over the last couple of weeks from both Black Lives Matter and then the counter protesters, as I think we're calling them. It would be a bit sort of dog bites man to ask what you think about the prospect of removing Winston Churchill from Parliament Square, I think. But what's your view on this proposal to make it easier to prosecute people who perpetrate criminal damage against war memorials and other public monuments?
It's something I know the Home Office is looking at, and there is a proposal for a private member's bill to cover this. War memorials are of exceptional importance because in the 20th century, so many hundreds of thousands of people from this country gave their lives to defeat tyranny, and they were, by and large, young men who went off from their place of work at terrible risk to themselves and loss to their families, and they deserve to be respectfully remembered, not to have the memorials defaced. And we protect many other things. We recently had a law introduced to protect emergency service workers if going about their crucial tasks they are attacked, and to commemorate those who died in service of the nation and to defend the memorials to them does not seem to me to be unreasonable.
Do you think that, currently I think the proposal is that it will simply be that it will remove the £5,000 value of damage needed to bring a full prosecution. Do you think that that's I don't know. Do you think that's an appropriate level? Do you think that maybe I've seen some people claiming that, the prospect of up to 10 years in prison is perhaps too much? Or do you think that it's about right?
Well, all these things have to be decided by judges in the end, don't they? I'm a great believer in judicial discretion because you don't want to get into the situation where somebody gets a very severe sentence for something that was fundamentally accidental. On the other hand, you do want to protect memorials that commemorate huge sacrifices that people made in the past. And I find always very moving when you go around the country, if you were allowed to at the moment, you're not, of course, going to village churches. Every church, pretty much, in this country, very small number of exceptions, has that list of names, very often members of the same family, who gave their lives in either the First World War or the Second World War for our freedom. And to face such monuments seems to me an attack on a memory that should be honoured, and a particularly nasty form of vandalism, a thoughtless form of vandalism.
So when it comes to how these monuments managed to get defaced in the first place, what do you think about the way that the police have responded, not only to the initial incidents, but then to the incidents over the weekend? Because, there's been some criticism of the police because they've been, gone on the record. In fact, some senior officers have gone on the record as saying that they don't actually view their responsibility as the protection of public property. And there was the Chief Constable of Essex Police said that his priority was making sure that those who were engaged in this kind of sort of public disorder were doing so safely. And some have then suggested that then created a space, if you like, for the right-wing counter-protesters to step up. Do you think that the police should have perhaps been slightly more proactive in preventing the initial vandalism?
I think policing is extremely difficult, and politicians have to be very careful about interfering in detailed policing matters because they're making decisions on the ground with the resources that they've got. However, when you ask the fundamental question, do the police have a responsibility to protect property? Yes, of course they do. That's one of the things the police are there to do. Do they have to balance the protection of property against potentially making a situation worse, or not necessarily having sufficient resources at a particular time to protect property? Then that's another issue, and that's an issue that needs to be made by the individual police officer on duty. But the general principles that the police must be responsible for day-to-day policing. They must be responsible for operational decisions. That is absolutely constitutionally right. But we are entitled to hold them to account for the decisions that they make as politicians, and therefore they are not immune from criticism. But equally, the politicians are entitled to set out the principles of policing and what the priorities should be. And clearly, one of the things the police are meant to do is to protect property.
So, I remember the riots in 2011, and there was quite strong criticism of the police then, because there was a sense that for several days they sort of stood back and allowed those to develop and to get much worse rather than confronting the rioters. Do you think that in this instance this is simply a case of officers making decisions based on the resources they had at the time, or do you think that perhaps there is a need for politicians or the government, once it's got a bit of distance from the immediate crisis, to have a look at the terms on which the police engage in public order incidents like this?
Well, I think, as usual, the Home Secretary has been very clear and very robust, and I think we are very lucky to have a very clear-sighted Home Secretary who is willing to make important announcements and say what she thinks ought to happen. But of course, the politicians are entitled to set out the basic requirements for what the police have to do, but are not entitled to determine individual events at the moment of the policing. But the police do then get held to account. So this is part of our natural constitutional process. So the police make a decision. That decision is not one that the politicians should interfere in, but absolutely after the decision has been made, backbench MPs can raise that on the floor of the House of Commons. It can be debated, and the police can be held to account, as can and should be the police and crime commissioners who bring some representative element to policing.
Well, I was going to say, on the subject of police and crime commissioners, are you surprised that, for example, the Conservative Police and Crime Commissioner for Essex doesn't appear to have spoken out in response to his Chief Constable's comments? Do you think that the police and crime commissioners are working in that role that was intended for them to have, of providing a kind of public accountability to policing? Or do you think that maybe they've just ended up as part of the policing establishment?
I'm afraid I'm in deep ignorance of the Police and Crime Commissioner of Essex. It's not my constituency, and unfortunately I don't follow his statements with the assiduity that I probably should. I do apologise to listeners to Conservative Home for that lacuna in my attention to my duties.
No problem, perhaps a bit specific. On the subject of statues, what do you think of Lindsay Hoyle's announcement that he's going to review the statuary and artwork in the House of Commons? Has he discussed this with you? Do you know roughly what his terms of reference are going to be for that?
I was some years ago on the Speaker's Advisory Panel on works of art, which looked at new commissions or adding to the collection. And I think it's important that the collection is a live collection and a growing collection. Although this was the Lords rather than the Commons, a few years ago, I suppose it must have been in 2010, they completed the copies of the Armada tapestries thanks to a generous donation from an American philanthropist that had been started, and they'd only managed to do one of them when Prince Albert was still alive, and the other, I think, 5 hadn't been started, let alone completed. And so there is an enormously long time scale in changes to the artwork in the House of Parliament. I think that took from about 1860 to 2010 to complete the process. And they're in the Prince's Chamber and well worth looking at. They were briefly displayed in the Royal Gallery, and so one could see them at eye level. But there are long runs in changes to parliamentary artwork.
Okay, so we're not expecting anything dramatic anytime soon. And then I suppose the last question on this particular topic, what do you think, obviously private organisations can do whatever they like, but what do you think about, publicly funded bodies such as Guy's Hospital proposing to remove the statues of their founder and benefactor? Do you think that the government, because Oliver Dowden has said that the government's not going to be removing any statues on its own property, but do you think that the government has some kind of role in whether or not publicly funded bodies such as hospitals like that on their attitude towards the commemoration of the past?
I don't think central government can aim to run every public body in the country and interfere in the minutiae of the decision-making of those public bodies, that they have responsibility to act within their remit. However, they may well be subject to planning permission, and they're not exempt from the normal requirements that affect everybody in the country. It's with the question of statues, it is very rare that there is somebody who is purely bad, and therefore you are always entering into a discussion as to people's relative merits. And I think that's best done by local communities rather than nationally, in bodies that are local rather than national. But I certainly think the government is right to have taken its approach to defend the statues that are under the government's ambit that are currently erected.
Fair enough. Okay, so we're going to move on. Now, I know that Paul spoke to you last week about your efforts to bring back the House of Commons and balancing the needs to balance the virtues of having the Commons physically present with the need for access for MPs who are shielding. So I'm not going to go into the weeds of that again. But I was just wondering, has the experience of a virtual House of Commons and then the challenges of bringing it back, has this given you spurred any thoughts about future reforms to the House of Commons after, touch wood, we return to normal life? Because I know that ever since I think Robin Cook was leader of the House of Commons, there have been continual changes to the way that the House of Commons operates in ways which have sometimes not, at least in my view, enhanced the way that it operates. I'm thinking in particular of the fact that we now often have MPs being reduced to giving 2-minute speeches because of programme motions and so on. Do you think that this experience, having emphasised, if you like, the virtues of having the House of Commons able to do its job properly, to scrutinise at length and in person, will this be a spur not just to a return to the status quo ante once COVID-19 has passed, but for further reforms to the House of Commons whilst you're the leader?
I, and this may surprise you, was extremely keen to get the virtual House of Commons up and running because I was worried in the middle of April that we would have no scrutiny and no debate at all. But what came of it showed why a virtual House of Commons doesn't work. And I had hoped that it would be a more exciting, more representative of the ordinary processes of Parliament than it was. And I think that's very important because the procedures of the House of Commons are not an end in themselves. They are a means to an end. Do they make Parliament work well? And it turns out that actually our procedures are there for a purpose and that they ensure lively debate and they hold the government to account. As a minister, it is much harder when it is physical rather than when it's virtual. When it's virtual, it is really easy for a minister to answer questions. You've got plenty of time. You've got a good connection because you're in the chamber. The person coming in might have a bad connection. There's no comeback. There's no sense that the House isn't following you or isn't taking your argument because it was all pretty much in silence. And so bringing that back has been very important and has shown that a lot of what we do is there for a purpose. Having said that, I agree with you, and this was clear with the hybrid Parliament, that if you just give people 3 minutes to make a prepared monologue, deliver a prepared monologue, that's no debate. And that actually applies in the physical format too, that these very short speeches aren't really a debate. They are a spoken press release, and that is not an exciting way of developing ideas. So I think you need to look at the balance, so this is a matter of the Speaker rather than me, between getting everybody in on every occasion and recognising that if people just speak for a very short time, you're not actually having a proper debate.
Well, to an extent, it's, of course, how the rules are applied as they stand is a matter for the Speaker. But I think, I don't think anyone would deny that Robin Cook, for example, played a hugely influential role whilst Leader of the House in shaping the way in which the House conducted its business. So I think my question was really, even notwithstanding the question of COVID-19, are there ways in which you being a parliamentarian of great experience and who's now in this leadership position, are there ways in which you think that the way the House operates could be improved to further enhance, if you like, the accountability, the ability to debate, and so forth? Once, notwithstanding COVID-19, just once we're back in a normal parliamentary circumstances.
I mean, I think the trade-off that was made was between time and certainty. And lots of MPs want to know for certain when business will end and when votes will take place. That inevitably reduces the time available for debate, and that means that you get, to some extent, a less lively debate. But MPs are now quite used to the certainty that they have had, and that's where programming came in. Programming is interesting because programming in committee works really very well, and you will be appalled, possibly, that I'm saying this. And the reason it works well is that people use the time to debate all the clauses, whereas before there was programming, essentially filibusters would take place, so that at the end of the whole process, the opposition could say, we only got to clause 2. They only got to clause 2 because they only wanted to get to clause 2. And now, because you know that you've got 4 days, 6 days, how many days in committee, each clause is at least looked at. And so the programming committee has improved scrutiny. Programming on the floor of the House has reduced time, but it's reduced time because MPs want certainty. And so the question really is, would MPs rather lose that element of certainty to spend more time? If they did, they would certainly have my sympathy.
All right, fair enough. There's something to look forward to when the times permit. So my next question is, do you think that the response to the way that the COVID-19 has panned out with relation to the devolved assemblies, now this is my hobby horse, I will confess, do you think in retrospect that it might have been preferable for the government to try and pursue a more nationally coordinated response to COVID-19? It's been suggested to me that there were legislative vehicles which could have been used to implement a UK government-led approach, to a much more UK government-led approach, and that would have avoided an awful lot of the confusion that we've seen. Do you think that's a legitimate view, or do you think that the current strategy was the right one?
We have the devolved settlement that we have got, and I think it's important that the government respects that. I think the political difficulty of doing things that appeared to undermine the devolution settlement that we've got in response to a crisis would have been a distraction from dealing with the crisis. So I think your hobby horse is a very good hobby horse to have. I think anything that can be done to strengthen the union is worth doing, but I'm not convinced that if unionist things had been done, nationwide things had been done in response to a crisis, it would have managed to maintain the necessary consent for emergency processes that was needed from Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland. So I think it's harder than you say, although, of course, the legal technicality, or important legal constitutional point, as endorsed by the Supreme Court, is that the House of Parliament remains the sovereign parliament for the whole of the United Kingdom.
Yes, okay, fair enough. I think the suggestion was that there was actually specifically public health legislation, although I've not been able to track it down on the statute book. But that is fair enough. How seriously?
Well, wait, sorry to come back to that, but
go ahead.
The major point was not pre-existing public health legislation. It was the COVID Act that was brought forward to give emergency powers, and a new act was being brought forward under the current constitutional conventions. If you're going back to I think it's the 1984 Health Act that gives certain emergency powers to the Health Secretary. That act was passed obviously under a different context. And once you were moving to the necessity for an emergency piece of legislation, I think it had to represent the current constitutional situation rather than one in the 1980s.
Why was the 1980s legislation, was there other than devolution, was there a reason that the 1984 Act was not appropriate for tackling COVID-19?
Yes, it simply didn't cover all the circumstances that had arisen. It had some emergency powers. It allowed the Health Secretary to keep somebody in quarantine who'd flown back. Do you remember? And they went to a hotel outside Liverpool, or Manchester. Anyway, they went to a hotel somewhere, and one of them wanted to leave and didn't want to stay in quarantine. And that act provided powers to issue an order saying that person had to stay until the period was completed.
Okay, that's how. Okay,
but it didn't by any means do everything that was needed to tackle the crisis.
Okay, fair enough. And I know that Scottish Conservatives are deeply concerned with the way that the SNP have been able to exploit, if you like, COVID-19 in order to bolster the prestige of Nicola Sturgeon and to undermine the British government, even though the British government has been doing, extraordinary work to prop up the national economy. How seriously is to the extent that you can say this, how seriously is the government taking the threat of an SNP victory in the next Scottish elections? And do you think that in those circumstances we would end up fighting another Scottish independence referendum? Or do you think the government would be still right to say that 2014 was a once-in-a-generation vote and that should stand?
Well, the SNP said that 2014 was a once-in-a-generation vote. And they now like to think it's a generation of a fruit fly rather than of a human being. So I don't think they can get away with saying a generation has passed. I think we are very lucky in the Scottish Secretary. I think Alistair Jack is a very effective minister and campaigner. And I think Nicola Sturgeon will be held to account for her record that a lot of UK taxpayer money has gone to all parts of the country, but the money has been distributed because of decisions made on a UK-wide basis. Scotland's managing of the crisis does not seem to be as good as that of England, and that is the responsibility of Nicola Sturgeon, for which she will no doubt be held to account by her voters.
We can all hope. So I suppose the last one is it's something that I write about a fair amount, which is, I don't know if did you see that over the weekend there were two very large illegal raves in Manchester? I don't know if you saw this story.
I didn't go to either of them, as it happened.
I didn't suggest that you went.
But I did hear about them, yes, indeed.
So I suppose my question is, there's a real danger that with COVID-19 lockdown provisions for the nightclub industry particularly extending onwards almost indefinitely, because obviously it's very hard to operate a nightclub without, with social distancing in place and all of that. I think there's a real danger that we'll see more instances like this where at best amateurs and at worst criminals trying to move into the nightclub and party scene because, young people who are not at risk, particularly of COVID-19, are getting increasingly impatient. So I was just wondering because obviously nightclubs aren't really a constituency that tends to have a lot of sympathy in Westminster. How across that danger is the government? And do you think that we will see hopefully over the summer, some action with regards to allowing legal and safe raves and parties and festivals to continue, or is this something that's simply not going to be possible to do responsibly within the current public health environment?
A socially distanced nightclub sounds to me about the only sort of nightclub that I would like going to. But leaving that to one side, my view of all the restrictions is that they have actually happened by consent rather than compulsion. Yes, the laws have been passed, and yes, the police have the powers that they have. But actually, lockdown was introduced and has been followed because people were willing to do it and to go along with it. And the regulations can only remain in place as long as there is that consent. And that there will be a point at which people are able to go back to normal life. That there's been a lot of talk about reviews of the social distancing guidance, and it's guidance, the 6.5 feet guidance rather than absolute rule that will be enforced by a policeman. And therefore, as time goes on, I'm sure we will get to the point where legal nightclubs once again take place. And I was very struck by a headline in the Telegraph pointing out that the risk to children of the coronavirus was lower than the risk of being struck by lightning. And ultimately, restrictions will be lifted and people will make choices over how they behave. But fundamentally, this extraordinary restriction on our liberties that has been accepted by society has been accepted by consent, not compulsion. And I think that underlies the whole way the government has managed this crisis, and is the right and British way to have done it.
I take your point entirely about the lockdown being publicly led. I suppose the concern would be that, there's always this democratic concern about wolves and sheep, that a broad consensus maintained by the majority could end up negatively affecting sort of minority interests that don't command majority support. But I hope that isn't the case, and that over the next few months we will end up seeing a more general restriction lifted. But there is always this worry that and this has been raised before about how we lift, if we end up partially lifting lockdown, the easier and lighter the burden of lockdown gets on society as a whole. It becomes easier, if you like, to leave small groups under excessive restrictions or very onerous restrictions because they're no longer being borne by the majority.
Yes and no. It's not that I don't see your point, but that don't we all belong to a minority where we may be affected by the rules not being changed? So you may represent the nightclub generation rather better than I do, but I'm certainly quite keen on being able to go to Mass again. And so there will be a coalition of minorities of people who, if the restrictions just get forgotten about in certain areas, will be saying, well, hold on, what about us? And so that will help ensure that groups don't get forgotten as we begin to open up.
Well, I look forward to joining hands with you and storming the barricades if that becomes necessary.
I've never been one much for joining hands before this crisis arose. So I'm not sure we'll join hands, but we might
very well
shoulder a few inches closer to shoulder than we are currently allowed.
Fair enough. Okay, well, in which case, I think that's about what we have time for. Thank you very much, Jacob, for taking the time to speak to us. It's been a pleasure. Thank you for letting me intervene on the show. It's been great fun. And we'll talk to you again in a couple of weeks.
I've enjoyed many of your articles, so I'm very glad to have a telephonic introduction. So thank you.
Thank you very much.
The Moggcast, a fortnightly conversation with Jacob Rees-Mogg about the topics of the day.